At 42 years old, Luke Callahan had survived 11 years that many believed no man could endure. Yet nothing on the lonely trail prepared him for what waited beyond the final bend. Smoke curled gently from the stone chimney of the cabin he and his father had built with their own hands. A saddled horse grazed beside the old split-rail fence, and through the front window flickered the warm glow of a fire that should never have been there. Then the cabin door opened, and instead of finding the empty home he had carried in his memory through every hard mile of his journey, he found a young woman standing protectively in the doorway, while a little girl clutched a rag doll behind her skirt. In that single heartbeat, Luke realized someone else had been living inside the only place he had ever truly called home. Before we continue this journey together, if stories of courage, justice, and the untamed American frontier have a special place in your heart, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The afternoon sun rested warmly across the Colorado Valley, turning the tall grass into waves of gold beneath the breeze. Snow still crowned the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains, while cottonwood trees whispered softly along the creek that wound past the old Callahan homestead. Time had weathered the cabin's rough pine logs, but Luke recognized every beam, every stone, and every fence post as though he had never left. He dismounted slowly, careful not to alarm the strangers. The woman watched every movement with cautious eyes. She appeared to be no older than 30, her chestnut brown hair neatly tied behind her neck, a faded blue prairie dress covered by a cream apron that had clearly seen years of honest work. Behind her peeked a little girl with bright blue eyes and golden curls, holding tightly to a handmade rag doll that looked nearly as old as the cabin itself. For several long moments, no one spoke. Finally, Luke removed his black hat. "I don't mean to frighten you," he said gently. "My name is Luke Callahan." The woman tightened her grip on the doorframe. "I'm Emma Brooks." She hesitated before continuing. "And this is my daughter, Grace." The little girl offered only a shy nod before hiding behind her mother again. Luke glanced toward the familiar porch swing his father had built years before. It still hung from its chains, though one arm had been carefully repaired. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows, and fresh herbs grew beside the steps. Whoever lived here had not neglected the place. "You've taken good care of it," Luke said quietly. Emma looked confused. "We've tried." Silence settled between them once more. Luke finally asked the question weighing upon his heart. "How long have you been living here?" Emma answered honestly. "Almost 4 years." The words struck harder than he expected. 4 years. 4 full years had passed, with strangers sleeping beneath his father's roof. "I suppose someone should explain," Emma said carefully. "People told us this cabin had been abandoned for years." Luke frowned. "Abandoned?" She nodded. "My husband died during the harsh winter 5 years ago. We lost our farm soon afterward. Grace and I stayed wherever we could, until Sheriff Briggs told us there was an empty cabin outside town whose owner had never returned." Luke felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. Never returned? Everyone believed he was dead. Grace looked up curiously. "Mama said the cowboy who lived here was brave." Emma offered an apologetic smile. "I hoped if he ever had family, they'd understand why we came." Luke's gaze drifted across the valley. The weathered barn still stood. The creek still flowed exactly where it always had. His father's windmill still turned lazily above the well. Everything familiar remained, yet somehow nothing felt the same. "I was never given the chance to return," he murmured. Emma studied him more closely. "You really are Luke Callahan?" "I am." She searched his face, perhaps expecting anger. Instead, she found only exhaustion. Luke had crossed mountains, rivers, and endless miles believing home would finally offer peace. Now he found 2 people who had suffered losses of their own, doing their best to survive beneath his roof. He could not blame them. Not yet. Emma stepped aside. "Would you come inside?" Luke paused before entering. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the cabin, mingling with smoke from the stone fireplace. Handmade quilts covered the old furniture. Benjamin Callahan's heavy oak table still occupied the center of the room, though it now held sewing supplies, a basket of apples, and Grace's wooden toys. The cabin had changed, yet somehow it still felt alive. Grace quietly placed another log onto the fire, while Emma poured coffee into a chipped enamel cup. "I wish I understood," Luke admitted. Emma sat opposite him. "So do I." She folded her hands. "When we arrived, the county records listed this property as abandoned. The taxes hadn't been paid for years. Folks said the owner disappeared more than a decade ago." Luke slowly reached inside his trail coat. From an inner pocket, he removed a folded, weathered document, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. "My father always told me never to travel without this." Emma unfolded it carefully. Her eyes widened. It was an original property deed. Signed, stamped, bearing the name Benjamin Callahan. Then, Luke Callahan. She looked back at him in disbelief. This says the cabin belongs to you. It always has." Neither spoke. The only sound came from the crackling fire. At last Emma whispered, "Then someone made a terrible mistake." Luke accepted the deed back with careful hands. "I intend to find out who." The next morning, before the first rays of sunlight reached the valley floor, Luke saddled his horse. Emma insisted on accompanying him, believing someone from the county should hear exactly what had happened, while Grace remained safely with a trusted neighbor until they returned. Together they rode toward Willow Creek, beneath a brilliant spring sky. By mid-morning, the town's church bell echoed across the busy streets, as wagons rolled between weathered storefronts, and merchants greeted familiar customers. Luke guided his horse toward the historic county courthouse, his eyes fixed upon the stone building standing proudly at the center of town. Inside, the scent of polished wood and old paper filled the quiet hallway. An elderly gray-haired courthouse clerk looked up from behind the counter as Luke approached. Luke placed the original property deed gently upon the polished wood. "I believe," he said calmly, "there has been some mistake concerning my land." The old clerk adjusted his spectacles, glanced at the deed, then slowly lifted his eyes toward Luke's face. Every trace of color disappeared from the man's expression. His hands began to tremble. He stared as though he were looking at someone who had stepped out of a grave. In a barely audible whisper, the elderly clerk breathed, That can't be possible." The old clerk's whisper seemed to still the very air inside the courthouse. That can't be possible." For several heartbeats, he simply stared at Luke Callahan as though he had seen a ghost step through the courthouse doors. His trembling fingers rested upon the faded property deed, tracing Benjamin Callahan's familiar signature before lifting uncertain eyes toward the weathered cowboy standing patiently across the counter. Emma Brooks remained beside Luke, sensing that something far greater than a simple clerical mistake had just revealed itself. The clerk swallowed hard. "Please, wait here." Without another word, he hurried through a doorway leading deeper into the courthouse. Luke exchanged a puzzled glance with Emma. "He looked frightened," she whispered. He did. Only moments later, another man emerged from the hallway. He carried himself with effortless confidence, dressed in an elegant black frock coat over a neatly pressed gray waistcoat. His silver hair was carefully combed, and his polished boots echoed softly against the hardwood floor. His smile was courteous enough to put strangers at ease, yet there was something strangely measured behind his calm gray eyes. "Mr. Callahan," he said warmly, extending his hand. What an unexpected surprise. Luke accepted the handshake without returning the smile. "You know who I am?" The man chuckled politely. "In a town this size, everyone remembers the Callahan family." He released Luke's hand. "My name is Samuel Granger, the county land commissioner." Luke nodded slightly. "I've come to correct whatever mistake was made regarding my property." "Of course." Samuel's pleasant expression never changed. "If you'll allow us a little time to examine the records, I'm certain we can clear everything up." The elderly clerk appeared again behind him, though he looked far less composed than before. His hands still trembled. Samuel noticed. "Mr. Parker," he said gently, Why don't you fetch the original land ledgers from the records office across the street? Those books should answer every question. The old clerk hesitated. But, Commissioner, Samuel's smile remained perfectly polite. The ledgers. Yes, sir. The clerk hurried away. Luke watched him disappear through the courthouse doors. Something about the exchange felt wrong. Samuel folded his hands comfortably behind his back. These old frontier records can become quite confusing after so many years. My father never found them confusing. Samuel's smile tightened ever so slightly. No, I suppose he didn't. Before Luke could reply, a loud shout echoed from outside. Fire! Another voice followed. The records building. Luke spun toward the courthouse windows. Across the street, thick black smoke rolled upward into the brilliant blue sky. Within seconds, bright orange flames burst through the roof of the county records office. People rushed into the street from every direction. Shopkeepers abandoned their businesses. Children were pulled safely behind wagons. Church bells rang wildly. Sheriff Nathaniel Briggs galloped into the square, shouting orders before his horse had even stopped. Bucket line. Move everyone back. Save the east wall. Townspeople raced toward the creek, carrying buckets, while others formed desperate lines between the water and the burning building. Luke wasted no time. He sprinted toward the inferno. Luke! Emma called after him, but he was already crossing the street. Heat crashed against him long before he reached the entrance. Burning timbers groaned overhead. Glass shattered onto the boardwalk. Smoke poured through every broken window. Sheriff Briggs caught his arm. Nobody goes inside. The land records are still in there. The roof's coming down. Luke looked toward the smoke-filled doorway. If those ledgers burn, the truth burns with them. The sheriff studied his determined face. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Briggs nodded once. You have one chance. Luke grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a nearby wagon. Someone soaked it in water. He wrapped it tightly around his shoulders before disappearing into the flames. Emma stood frozen in the street. Then, without another thought, she seized another wet blanket. I'm going after him. Sheriff Briggs reached toward her. It's too dangerous. So is leaving him alone. Before anyone could stop her, Emma disappeared into the burning building. Inside, smoke swallowed nearly every trace of daylight. Luke dropped low beneath the thick clouds of ash. The air burned his lungs. Flaming beams crashed onto the wooden floor behind him. Somewhere beyond the smoke stood rows of towering shelves, filled with decades of county history. He found them. Leather-bound ledgers lined every shelf. Many had already begun to burn. Luke grabbed as many as he could carry. Then another crash echoed through the building. A burning support beam blocked the doorway. For one terrifying moment, there seemed no way out. Luke. Emma's voice emerged through the smoke. I'm here. She appeared beside him, coughing but determined. Together they shoved the burning beam aside just enough to squeeze through. Each carried an armful of ancient ledgers. As they burst into the sunlight, the gathered townspeople erupted into relieved cheers. Sheriff Briggs hurried forward, helping them lower the heavy books onto the courthouse steps. Luke dropped to one knee, exhausted. Emma sat beside him, her face streaked with soot. The elderly clerk hurried over, staring at the rescued ledgers with tears in his eyes. You saved them. We saved what's left, Luke answered. Judge Eleanor Hastings arrived only minutes later. Her black bonnet cast a long shadow across her composed face as she surveyed the smoke still rising above the ruined records office. What exactly have we recovered? The old clerk carefully opened one of the surviving ledgers. Its leather cover was blackened. Several pages had been scorched, but the entries remained readable. He slowly turned page after page until his fingers suddenly stopped. His eyes widened. Mr. Callahan? Luke stepped closer. The clerk turned the heavy book toward him. There, written in faded ink beside the Callahan property, were words that silenced everyone gathered on the courthouse steps. Owner presumed deceased. Luke stared at the page without speaking. Emma looked from the ledger to Luke in disbelief. Judge Hastings quietly examined the surrounding entries. Another family. The same words. Then another. And another. Her expression grew increasingly grave. She closed the ledger with deliberate care. Looking toward Sheriff Briggs, she spoke with calm authority. "I want every surviving land ledger secured inside the courthouse." Then she turned to Luke, Emma, and the stunned townspeople gathered around them. This is no longer a question of one man's ranch. She rested her hand firmly upon the rescued records. It appears someone has been rewriting the history of this valley. The rescued ledgers rested beneath the careful watch of Sheriff Nathaniel Briggs, yet the weight pressing upon Luke Callahan's shoulders had little to do with the heavy leather books stacked across the courthouse table. As the afternoon light stretched through the tall windows, Judge Eleanor Hastings quietly reread the scorched pages, pausing every few moments to compare one family's record against another. The same troubling words appeared again and again, each written in the same careful hand. Owner presumed deceased. No one in the room spoke for several moments. Finally, the elderly clerk cleared his throat. "I remember Benjamin Callahan." Luke looked up. The old man smiled sadly. "He came here often. Your father never trusted a single copy of any official record." "What do you mean?" "He always said that if a man's home depended upon ink on paper, there ought to be another copy somewhere safe." Judge Hastings closed the ledger. "Did he ever tell you where?" The clerk shook his head. "No, but he once mentioned leaving something with Charles Ashford." Luke exchanged a glance with Emma. "Charles Ashford? The owner of Silver Creek Ranch," the judge replied. "He and your father were neighbors years ago." Sheriff Briggs reached for his hat. "I'll ride with you." Luke gently shook his head. "I appreciate it, Sheriff, but I'd rather speak with Mr. Ashford first. If my father trusted him, I owe him the chance to explain." Judge Hastings nodded. "Very well. The investigation will continue here while you're gone." Emma stepped beside Luke. "Then we're riding together." By early afternoon, they followed the winding trail through broad valleys painted with wildflowers, where cattle grazed peacefully beneath the towering Colorado Rockies. The miles passed quietly, giving Luke time to remember his father's steady voice and the lessons learned along these very hills. Benjamin Callahan had never measured wealth by the size of a ranch or the number of cattle grazing upon it. He believed a person's true legacy was the trust they left behind. Luke wondered whether his father had somehow seen this danger coming. Hours later, Silver Creek Ranch came into view. Unlike the modest Callahan homestead, Charles Ashford's estate spread across rolling hills, its white fences stretching farther than the eye could easily follow. Hands worked the corrals with practiced ease, while horses grazed beside a sparkling creek that gave the ranch its name. A ranch hand greeted them politely before leading Luke and Emma toward the large main house. Charles Ashford was already waiting on the porch. Though his silver beard and lined face revealed the passing years, his posture remained proud. His thoughtful eyes settled upon Luke, and for a long moment he simply stared. "I hoped," Charles said quietly, "that one day I'd see you again." Luke climbed the porch steps. "You knew I was alive?" Charles lowered his eyes. "I hoped you were." It was not the answer Luke expected. Inside the spacious study, shelves of leather-bound books covered every wall. Large windows overlooked the peaceful valley beyond, while maps, surveys, and framed photographs told the story of generations who had built lives upon the frontier. Charles walked slowly to an old oak cabinet. "I've been waiting many years to open this." From the cabinet he lifted a weathered leather journal, its edges worn smooth by time. Luke recognized it instantly. "My father's." Charles nodded. "He left it with me before you disappeared." Luke carefully accepted the journal. The leather felt familiar beneath his fingertips, as though the years between had quietly disappeared. He opened the first page. In Benjamin Callahan's unmistakable handwriting were simple words. "If you are reading this, my son, then events have unfolded exactly as I feared." Luke's breathing slowed. Page after page described Benjamin's growing concern that county land records were being quietly altered. Families vanished from official documents without explanation. Boundaries shifted. Deeds disappeared. Benjamin had begun creating duplicate surveys by hand, recording every property exactly as it had originally been claimed. Near the back of the journal, a folded map slipped onto the desk. Luke unfolded it carefully. A red X marked an abandoned silver mine high in the mountains. Beside it, Benjamin had written only one sentence: "The truth waits where honest men buried it." Emma looked toward Charles. "Why didn't you give this to anyone?" The older rancher sighed deeply. "Because Benjamin asked me not to unless Luke returned." Before Luke could ask another question, a deafening crack shattered the afternoon silence. Glass exploded inward. Charles instinctively turned as a rifle bullet smashed through the study window, splintering the bookcase behind him. Luke reacted without thinking. He grabbed Charles by the shoulder and threw both of them to the floor as another shot struck the porch railing outside. Emma hurried behind the heavy oak desk. The ranch hands rushed toward the front yard. Outside, several riders were already disappearing across the distant hills. Luke rose cautiously and looked through the broken window. "They weren't trying to rob you." Charles slowly stood. "No, they were trying to stop us." The room fell silent once more. Charles brushed shattered glass from his coat. "Benjamin warned me this might happen." Luke looked back at the journal. "The mine." Charles nodded. Benjamin trusted one man above everyone else. "Who?" "Thomas Mercer." Luke frowned. "I thought Thomas Mercer died years ago." "So did everyone else." Charles walked toward the large wall map hanging above the fireplace. With one finger he traced the narrow trail leading into the mountains. Thomas was a deputy marshal. When Benjamin discovered the records were being manipulated, Thomas agreed to protect the duplicate surveys. And he disappeared. Charles nodded slowly. People assumed he had been killed. Emma looked from one man to the other. But if Benjamin's note is true, Luke finished the thought, then Thomas may still be alive. The three of them wasted little time. With fresh horses saddled before sunset, they followed Benjamin's hand-drawn map into the rugged high country. Narrow trails twisted through towering pine forests before climbing toward jagged cliffs where the entrance to the abandoned silver mine stood hidden beneath decades of vines and fallen rock. The air grew cool as Luke lit a lantern. The mine stretched into darkness, silent except for the slow drip of water echoing through ancient tunnels. Following Benjamin's map, they passed rusted ore carts and broken timbers until the passage opened into a forgotten chamber. There, seated calmly beside a small iron stove, an elderly man slowly rose to his feet. His long gray beard reached nearly to his chest, and an old silver marshal's badge still rested upon his worn frontier coat. For several quiet moments, he simply studied Luke's face. Then a gentle smile appeared. "You have your father's eyes," he said. Luke stood speechless. "Thomas Mercer?" The old lawman tipped his hat. "I've been waiting 11 years for Benjamin's boy to find me." Luke took one step forward as Thomas reached beneath the table and lifted a heavy leather-bound register wrapped carefully in oilcloth. "I believe," the old marshal said softly, "this belongs in the hands of Willow Creek once again." Morning sunlight spilled across the mountains as Luke Callahan, Emma Brooks, Charles Ashford, and Thomas Mercer rode back toward Willow Creek. Cradled securely in Luke's saddlebag was the weathered survey register Benjamin Callahan had protected with such extraordinary foresight. Every mile carried more than old papers. It carried the hopes of families whose names had quietly disappeared from official records while no one questioned how it had happened. Word of their return spread quickly through town. By the time they reached the courthouse, a crowd had gathered outside the stone building. Farmers stood beside merchants, widows beside ranch hands, each wearing the same uncertain expression. Sheriff Nathaniel Briggs met them on the courthouse steps, relief washing over his face when he saw Thomas Mercer dismount. "I never thought I'd see you again," the sheriff said. Thomas smiled gently. "Neither did the men who wanted me forgotten." Inside the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Hastings called the proceedings to order. The rescued land ledgers rested upon one table, while Luke carefully placed Benjamin's original survey register beside them. The elderly courthouse clerk adjusted his spectacles with trembling hands, recognizing Benjamin's precise handwriting before he had even opened the cover. Judge Hastings turned the first page. The courtroom fell silent. Each property was recorded in careful detail, complete with original boundary lines, witness signatures, and dates that matched the earliest settlement of Willow Creek. Benjamin had written everything twice, leaving no room for doubt. One by one, the judge compared the original register against the county ledgers rescued from the fire. The differences were unmistakable. Entire properties had been altered. Names had disappeared. Boundaries had shifted. Beside dozens of families appeared the same false notation: owner presumed deceased. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Emma reached for Luke's hand, not to comfort him alone, but because she understood that every family represented by those pages had carried a burden much like her own. Judge Hastings looked toward Samuel Granger. "You have served as county land commissioner for many years." "I have. Can you explain these alterations?" Samuel remained composed, though the confidence that had marked his every movement now seemed strained. There must be some misunderstanding. Thomas Mercer stepped forward. "There isn't." The old marshal removed a small leather pouch from inside his coat. "I kept more than Benjamin's register." From the pouch he produced several folded letters, each bearing official county seals. The judge accepted them carefully. They revealed unauthorized land transfers, forged certifications, and payments made in exchange for properties whose rightful owners had been falsely declared dead or permanently missing. Samuel's face slowly lost its color. Charles Ashford lowered his head. "I should speak." Every eye turned toward him. "I discovered irregularities years ago," Charles admitted quietly. "I confronted Samuel, but I accepted his assurances instead of demanding the truth. I wasn't part of the fraud, but I lacked the courage to expose what I suspected. That failure has weighed upon me every day since." The courtroom remained silent. Luke looked at the older rancher. "My father trusted you." "I know." Charles's voice broke. "And I have spent 11 years wishing I had been worthy of that trust." Judge Hastings closed the final letter. "The evidence speaks for itself." She turned to Sheriff Briggs. "Nathaniel." The sheriff stepped forward. Samuel Granger looked around the courtroom, searching familiar faces that no longer offered comfort. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "I never imagined it would go this far," he said quietly. "No lie ever stays buried forever," Thomas Mercer replied. Without resistance, Samuel surrendered himself to the sheriff. No cheers echoed through the courtroom. Only silence. It was the silence of a community finally understanding how many lives had been quietly changed by decisions made behind closed doors. Over the following weeks, Judge Hastings supervised the restoration of every property proven to have been taken unlawfully. Families returned to farms they believed were lost forever. Old deeds were corrected, boundaries restored, and names written once again where they had always belonged. When Luke's own deed was officially returned to him, he accepted it with humble gratitude rather than triumph. "This isn't only my victory," he told the judge. "It belongs to everyone whose home was returned." Emma stood nearby, smiling softly. She knew those words sounded exactly like something Benjamin Callahan would have said. Charles Ashford kept his promise as well. He used his own resources to repair damaged fences, replace livestock that had been lost through disputed ownership, and help struggling families begin again. He understood that forgiveness could never be purchased, but honest restitution was where it had to begin. As for Thomas Mercer, he chose not to remain in town. His work, he believed, had finally been completed. Before leaving, he handed Benjamin's journal back to Luke. "Your father never expected perfect men," Thomas said. "He only hoped the next generation would choose what was right when the time came." Luke nodded. "I'll remember." Weeks later, the Callahan cabin looked much as it had in Luke's childhood, yet somehow warmer than ever before. Fresh flowers bloomed beneath the windows. The repaired porch swing creaked gently in the evening breeze. Grace laughed beneath the old cottonwood tree, while chasing butterflies across the meadow, her rag doll tucked safely beneath one arm. Emma worked beside the garden, humming quietly as the last rays of sunlight painted the valley in gold. Luke stepped onto the porch carrying Benjamin's journal. Inside its back cover, he found one final note he had somehow overlooked. Home is not the place waiting for you when you return. Home is the place where truth is welcomed, burdens are shared, and strangers become family. Luke closed the journal and looked across the peaceful valley. 11 years earlier, he had believed he was riding home to reclaim a cabin. Instead, he had found something far greater. He had found justice where there had been deception, hope where there had been despair, and a family he never expected waiting behind his own front door. As evening settled over the Colorado Rockies, a lantern glowed beside the cabin door, just as it had years before. Only now its light welcomed not one weary traveler, but 3 people who had discovered that a home is never defined by ownership alone. It is defined by the hearts willing to protect it. Thank you for riding with us through Luke Callahan's journey. If this story reminded you that truth, kindness, and perseverance can outlast even the longest years of hardship, we'd love to hear from you. What is one moment in your own life when something you thought was lost found its way back to you? Until our next journey across the frontier, take care of one another, and we'll meet again on the trail.